The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo session today, we are lucky to have Keith Schengili-Roberts as our visiting TC Dojo master. When I saw Keith at the STC Summit in May, we both commented on how frequently we hear questions about keys and reuse. And you'll hear more about that in a minute. Keith is a longtime practitioner of information architecture, which is why we tapped him for this very special TC Dojo session. He is a researcher, an information gatherer, and that explains why he is so good at information architecture. He likes to find out things and see how they fit together. He can work at the bottom or the top, and we're grateful he can talk to us today about one of the highly requested topics. He lectures at the University of Toronto and works for the DITA Oasis Committee and Ixiasoft. We're thrilled Keith can join us today in the TC Dojo. Keith wants you to save your questions until the end, so be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. All right, Keith, I'll pass control to you, and it's all yours.
Okay, let's see. Show my screen monitor 2. You should hopefully be seeing my samurai visage. A simple guide to DITA keys. Hello, everybody. Welcome. As Liz said, my name is Keith Schengili-Roberts. I'm with Ixiasoft, and welcome to the TC Dojo. And we will get started on the topic of DITA keys. So here's what we're going to have a look at. Hang on. There we are, flipping the page. So basically do a quick introduction, then have a look at the how and also importantly the why of DITA keys. Have a look at some of the advantages of using keys, and then looking at how keys can be used to handle document variables and variables and air quotes there quite deliberately, because they're not actual variables from a strict computer science standpoint. Then we're looking at using keys to reference images, then creating an image warehouse, and then adding, oh, actually that should be a separate line, adding keys to topic refs, then keys and conditional processing, and then looking quite seriously at, how far the rabbit hole do you need to go when you're looking at keys? How far is too far? Because that is an issue that comes up, and so we'll explore that issue briefly. Then a list of some other items that I recommend in terms of reading and reviewing on the subject, and then a QA session. So Liz has already talked a little bit about me. I'm the DITA evangelist and market researcher with Ixiasoft, and I advocate for DITA usage and talk about best practices. I'm also the company's liaison with the Oasis, which is the standards body that maintains and promotes the DITA standard. Speaking of which, I'm also the chair of the DITA Adoption Committee, which again is very much trying to get the ideas about best practices out there, and quite recently we've done things like, say, the listening sessions, where we're trying to understand more about people who are actually using DITA and the issues and choices that they face. I'm also an industry researcher, meaning that I'm trying to understand the reasons why and how people are using DITA, and this has actually been terrific. I love finding out how and why people are using DITA. Many of the reasons are the same, but every now and then I run across some new scenarios, or it's being used in a new way, and I try to document that and try to spread the news about that to help promote the use of DITA. And I've got over a dozen years of experience with DITA, so the gray hairs you see in that picture are well earned. Some of you may also know me as DITA Writer. This is an industry blog I started just over 6 years ago with just shy of 275,000 hits to it, with plenty of information about things like DITA conferences, books on DITA, companies using DITA, plenty of information on DITA use, and feature interviews, so on and so forth. So if you're not aware of it, go check it out. I recommend it. Now, little story about how this webinar came about. So there's a picture of Liz. So at the SEC conference earlier this year, I ended up talking to a few people on the very opening session, as there were, as people were roaming around the booths and talking about, whatever came off the top of their heads, with the inspiration of having a glass of wine or beer or some other spirit, and tongues got to wagging, and people were talking about, the one thing I really, have problems with is trying to understand keys. And this came not only from people who were using DITA, but also those who were considering using DITA. And basically at shortly after those conversations, I talked to Liz, because I've done some TC dojos before, and I asked her, look, Liz, can I please tackle this subject? Clearly, there needs something needs to be done about this. And I wanted to tackle the subject of DITA keys, as I say here, with an emphasis on the basics. So I'm not going to be talking into any depth in terms of things like, say, key scopes or anything, like very complex key-based processes. I'm really just going to, because I think the basics have not been covered off terribly well, and that brings me to this. I mean, there's often to focus on the mechanics of keys, with very little discussion as to the why. So I plan to answer not only, how does it work, but, why would you want to do that? And there may be cases where you do not want to do that. And again, I want to reiterate, this webinar looks at the basics, and I'm using a step-by-step set of code examples that I've created that build upon each other. And by the way, while this presentation will use screenshots of the Oxygen XML editor, the focus is on code rather than tools. One of the issues I've had with some previous things I've seen and read on DITA keys is that they seem to rely, or they can rely, too often on the tools, and that tends to obscure the what goes on at the code level beneath. So again, I'm definitely trying not to hide that. And as I mentioned before, hey, look, there's code examples. For this TC Dojo system, I've created a set of code examples showing a step-by-step progression and layers of abstraction of key use, and they are available from GitHub, from the DITA Writer repository, and you can go in, download them, play with them, do whatever you like. And at the end of this slide deck, I actually have a slide dedicated to that shows which parts of the slide correspond to which of the code samples that you see listed here. So my target document, because I needed to have something real to work with in coming up with the code examples, going back into the really early days of computing, I ran across this document for the TRS-80, better known as the Trash-80, expansion interface. This is a computer peripheral, basically allowing access to amazing technology for the time, such as being able to plug in a cassette recorder to record and play back your data into your Trash-80 computer. Anybody remember that? I sure do. And the great thing about this is that this manual is now long out of copyright and is freely available from Project Gutenberg. And so what I've done with it is that I have lightly DITA-fied it, and it's the basis for the samples used in the webinar. And I should really add that this manual is only really lightly DITA-fied. So while everything is in typed topics, there's plenty more that can and probably should be done to make it look and read more like a modern manual. But on the flip side, it's good to know how far we have come, because if you look at this, you'll realize, boy, they say they don't make things the way they used to, and maybe that's a good thing. So the how and why of DITA keys. So, what are keys really? The keys are an indirect referencing mechanism. And by that, the typical, this is where people's eyes start to glaze over, and they mean, they think, what do you mean indirect? And as I say here, think of it this way: instead of pointing directly to a thing such as an external URL or variable text strings or images, you just use the key whose name can then be referenced instead. So you might want to say, a direct addressing example could be something like, say, a TRS-80, which is in this case the name of the product. Whereas indirect addressing would have as the as the key would have the product name, which would then be referenced as TRS80. So you have two parts here. Now the thing is that with a more common example for direct addressing that you might run across is to use say a URL or URI for a topic ref or for a web address. But I think this example makes things more concrete. You have a product name and then you have the actual thing that it resolves to. And by the way, indirect referencing has a long history. As an idea, goes all the way back to the 1960s. And the first instance that I can find where it's referenced is to an old language called Snowball, a string-oriented and symbolic language used back when the IBM 7094, and if you can see in that picture there, not only magnetic readers, but that thing in front of all those people is an actual punch card reader and maker. So it goes way back. It's a concept that has been in computer science for a long time. And one of the key things key things about keys are bad puns are going to be part of this session. I'm terribly sorry, it can't really be helped. But maps provide the context for keys. This is really the main difference between conrefs and keys, because keys are always scoped to the map that they reside in. So so as they say here, if context is for kings, then DITA maps are definitely royalty. And for those who don't know, this quote's lifted from the 3rd episode of the new Star Trek Discovery series. Yeah, I'm a Trekkie, and I'm not above bringing in new memes when they're applicable. So there. So what are some of the advantages of keys? You can reference the key name for a thing, and it will use the value that's assigned to it. I mean, that's really the raison d'etre of keys. Now, the cool thing is that instead of changing the name for a product, URL, image, or whatever in multiple places, you only need to change it that once in the parent map that it's being referenced from. So you can always use the key name anywhere in your topics, and it will always be displayed or resolved in place. You can also use conditional processing to change the key that is referenced in a topic or which key definition is active in the map. And near the end, I actually will show you an example of that. So this is useful to ensure consistent naming and terminology across a documentation set. You get, hey, built-in consistency and content reuse. So, using keys really only makes sense with reuse in mind. Keys would not be useful at all within a single document because honestly, there's no point. If you are if you're creating a single document that will never ever be reused, don't use keys. Again, there's just no point in going the extra mile because without reuse, there's no purpose. But since DITA is built around the idea of reuse, the idea that you would be creating keys for use across multiple documents. So the idea of there just being a single document never being reused is hopefully in your own experience is going to be a fairly rare one. So now let's have a look at the parts of a key. And keys, I would argue, always consist of at least 3 parts. So there is the first part, which is the declared key name for a thing, which is typically called the key, and that's embodied by the image of the key in the bottom left that has product name. And then the second part is the target for that thing, which is then considered the key definition or perhaps the key value, which in this case is set to TRS80, and that's what we have for the little sort of lock mechanism there. And then we have the third part, which is calling upon the key name when it's actually required, and this is known as the key reference. So in this case, within the document, please retrieve and display the product name and we have an icon there of a little guy who is using a megaphone, calling for that thing to be used. Now, there are other presentations out there that combine, points 1 and 2 as one thing that they call the key definition, which consists of a key name and the key definition as /value. They're not wrong, but in this presentation, I break them into 2 separate things, as I think it makes the explanation of the mechanics of keys easier to understand from a coding perspective. And you'll see these same colorful icons on this page in many of the example pages that come to help drive the point home of the various parts of the key that are being used. So let's have an initial, basic no keys view of a book map. And in this particular case, what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is the bookmap view from Oxygen's DITA Maps Manager, and then the exact same thing from the code level. These views are in fact equivalent. And this is a fairly typical, if simple, DITA bookmap. And as you can see from the icons displayed on the left, the topics are typed. And after the front matter content, there are two separate parts to the document. Topic refs point directly to the URIs of individual DITA topic files. Okay, so now let's move to one layer of extraction. We can use keys to handle document variables. So it's handy to have variables, and again, I'm putting this in air quotes, or in DITA key-based equivalent, to handle typically one or two word terms that are prone to change for different contexts, such as, say, the company name, product name, model number, trademark, copyright terms, what have you. The great thing about this is that keys ensure that these terms are used correctly throughout all your technical documents. Now, and by the way, some of you might be wondering about, do I really need to set company name as a variable? Certainly the very first time I looked at that, I kind of wondered about that. But it's always possible that your company might be bought out by another firm, in which case, yeah, retrospectively, you might, realize that, like, okay, now we have to rename our things from company X to company Y. In this case, syncing manuals with a common company name, it really just makes sense. Wanting variables to handle product name and model number is, I think, fairly self-explanatory. And you might also want to store things like trademarks and copyrights that your firm holds or want to acknowledge as well within this sort of context. This is a good example of content consistency, because if you manage your keys across publications, you no longer have to worry about, is this trademark term, is it a TM or is it a registered trademark? If you have one area where you're keeping all of this information, you just need to reference it once and you're always consistent. This sort of thing is particularly important where, legal things come into play. So let's define keys directly within a map. And the simplest case is to define the keys within the publication map using keydef plus a keyword. So what you see on the left-hand side is the code within a map that has a keydef, and then keys equals computer name, and then we have under that topic meta keywords, and then the actual keyword that is being referenced, which is TRS-80. And then within a topic reference from the map, I then have the screen printer and line printer allow you to obtain hard copy and print the information generated by your, in this case, phrase keyref equals computer name. Now, this works, and this is a common way of doing things, and this is the most basic common level of abstraction you can do with keys. But the problem with this approach is that it limits reuse of the map definitions, because you have to define them in the map. So they're always there in the map, and there's no way to, you always have to have those rather long and unwieldy sections of map within all the other maps where you would want to share these same terms. Okay, so let's move to the next layer of abstraction, where you use a DITA topic instead to store those key values, which are then referenced from the map. So you want to point to a DITA topic that contains all the variables. This uses the keydef element, which is basically a topic ref for keys. And I really do mean the keydef is a topic ref for keys. It's directly from the standpoint of DITA inheritance. It is keydef is directly inherited in the DITA model from topic ref. So in effect, topic ref is its parent, and keydef is a specialized form of it. In this case, if you're wondering, keydef equals essentially a key definition, and keys is essentially the name of the location that is being declared. So in this case, what you're seeing in the code is that it points to a DITA file containing all of the product names, which in this case is called product_info.dita. And by the way, notice the line that says topic group, where it says processing role resource only. So what's going on there is that essentially, that means that it will not, so the content that appears in that topic is not going to appear directly at output. It's not going to be, so you're not going to have a page that has all of that content simply appearing within the document as a standalone thing. By the way, I should point out that the opposite value of this, and by the way, resource only is the default. If you in fact have topic group and then link to a key def without it, it will not actually, it should not by default include the information because it is a default. The opposite value for this is normal, which would bring in and make the content visible. So, don't do that. Okay, so now we want to, so that, we're pointing to the content in a key DITA file from the map, and this is the actual, here's some sample code from that DITA file. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing the full topic as seen in Oxygen's author view, and then a portion of the code referencing the computer name. So what you see here is, in this case, a phrase with the ID, computer name, and then TRS-80. And then after that, I have a draft comment that talks about what it is. So in this case, the key targets are phrase tags using specific IDs surrounding the value it represents. Now, if we want to use that within other topics referenced under the same map, we can use ConKeyRef, which is short for Content Key Reference, or ConRef using a key if you like, which then is used to call that keyed value. So within the code, so this is the bit where the have the little guy who is now calling for this key value. So we have now connect a ribbon cable between the left front ConKeyRef product underscore info, which comes from the map side, and then computer name in the other portion to bring up TRS-80 within that particular reference. So this is where all three parts come together in the code. So in this case, we have two examples. We have one with product underscore info / peripheral name, and then product underscore info / computer name. And in both cases, they will be called, and when resolved, they will appear within that topic with those values resolved. And here you go. This is what they actually look like. This is the author view from Oxygen showing that same topic, showing the resolved key values. And of course, the nice thing about Oxygen or other DITA capable editors is that they will show where key values are in fact being resolved, and that's exactly what you see with the little icons beside the TRS-80, the expansion interface, and while it's not here, also in this case, Radio Shack is also thrown in as another example, another key value. But and by the way, note that it's important that the tag used in the ID matches that of the target. For inline text, the phrase element works really well, and this is this is what's typically used. You could also use term, for example, though term usually by default in most processing will render the content in italics. That of course can be changed, but that it's up to you how you want to do that. So that is one looking at one fairly basic level of abstraction. But hey, why stop there? We can why stop with just product names and model numbers? So you can also use keys to reference things like images. So, and this particular document has a whole bunch of images which could be used in other publications. And we have in this case, the rear view interface connection, which points to figure 5.png, and various other images within this particular document. So we can use keys to reference those images so that they can then be easily reused in subsequent publications. And this is where the idea of creating an image warehouse comes about. And this is basically a recommended best practice. So on the left-hand side, what you can see is in the map, it's pointing to what's known as, so the key def is pointing to an image warehouse, and then the actual target file, image underscore warehouse.dita, and on the right-hand side, you see how that image underscore warehouse.dita file is actually pointing to those particular images. So on the left-hand side, we're saying, hey, go here to find information about these particular images, and on the right-hand side, it's referencing the actual specific instances of those images. Okay, so another thing is that a recommended best practice for, whoops, it's not going to the next page. Hang on a second. There we go. Recommended best practice for warehoused content, keyed warehouse content, is to use tables. And this makes it easier to tell at a glance what the image and its associated ID is for calling them within a ConKeyRef. The same also goes for things like product info, external URLs, such as, say, the company website or technical support URLs, whatever else you might have to reference within your publication. So if there are other common elements and or things that you need to reference, typically within your documentation, the recommended best practice is to have a warehousing topic that is keyed for those things, and to have one for each, so you don't throw in all of your images plus your external URLs plus your your product info and company name within one topic. You have them as separate warehouse DITA files, which you can then easily swap in and out as needed between your publications. Okay, so in terms of calling an image using a ConKeyRef, the process is essentially the same. So in this case, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the ConKeyRef is pointing to the name, which is image warehouse, and then what it should be resolving to in this case. So it's looking at image warehouse and then the individual instance of that, which in this case is figure 5. The one below it is again image warehouse and then figure 6. And then in the when that topic that references that is published, this is how it's actually resolved. So that's what you see on the right-hand side, and you can see with the orange arrow, that's what the beautiful image is actually being resolved to. So this is a second layer of abstraction. So in the first one, we were just using company name and product name and model number. That's one layer, and now we're now saying, hey, why don't we have another layer of abstraction and put things like images and other things within its own within its own set of keys. But hey, why stop there? So to further increase topic level reuse between documents, you can also add key names to your topic refs. These can then be referenced via a separate map file that can warehouse all commonly used topics. So whereas in the first case we were using a topic that referenced all of the images, we're now going to be referencing a map instead, using the mathref tag that within the existing book map that essentially says, here are all of the topics that you that you might want to use for your publication. And then when it comes to referencing them, you no longer point to them directly using an href, but you use the key name instead. So on the left-hand side, you see the new mapref added to bookmap, which points to a keydefs underscore topics dot DITA map. Sorry, it should say DITA map instead of DITA. And then in the right-hand side, this is what that actual map actually looks like. Contents of the keydefs underscore topics DITA map, which uses key attributes to name those individual topics. And you can see on the left-hand side, in the right-hand image, we have keydef, keys, and then the name it is given, which is then going to be referenced within individual topics, and then the actual full href for that individual DITA topic. So the topics will be referenced using the keys, and within this map file, they are fully resolved so that they can be pointed to and called upon within the parent map. So here's the example of what that then looks like. So in this case, the book map now uses topic refs with name keys, and its conrefs then call the topics that are referenced in that map ref from earlier in the book map. Now, from an information architect standpoint, you could also start a new document that uses at least some of the topics from this document, use a map reference to reference them, and then use a topic ref and plus key ref to call them in the new document. So the idea is that you wouldn't just have a one-for-one correspondence. That map ref should point to a map which has presumably many more topics which are commonly used within your publications, and you're then picking and choosing from those what you want to use for that for your particular publication. In the example that the example code that I posted to GitHub, it is in fact a one-to-one correspondence, but the understanding is that normally that would not be the case. Okay, now the other cool thing, sort of adding a layer on top of this, is that you can also use keys within conditional processing, and it works really well. So in this particular DITA map, conditional processing for product equals TRS-80 references different keys than for the product, which is then set to the fictional TRS-90. So we have two sets of key defs. So you can see where it says product equals TRS-80, keys equals product info, same as before, and then individual topic, which is product info TRS-80 DITA, and then two lines down for that, the equivalent product info topic, which is called TRS90.DITA. And the same then goes for the image warehouse, which has different images, one set for the TRS80 document and the other set for the TRS90 document. And this is a relatively straightforward way of referencing different topics or images or URLs for different products, platforms, audiences, however, or however you want to do it. And by the way, at this point, I need to mention that using keys makes you completely map dependent. So if you produce output from single topics and you want to use keys, you'll have to transition those publications to be map based. And writers have to get used to working with topics in the context of a map if they want to see the full content resolved. This, as a colleague of mine, Lee White, says, this is often an unexpected surprise for many writers who are not used to seeing this sort of behavior within a typical editor. And most often, if things are not properly coded, you will get unresolved key errors, and then comes the problem of, well, where has the error occurred? And that can actually be can be quite tricky. Now, in terms of the effects, here is using the DITA val with keys on the example document. And in this case, while it's going to be hard to read, the first line says a brief overview of the additional features that the expansion interface can add to your TRS-80. And on the one on the right, it says the equivalent except for TRS-90. And the images are also in each version are altered. One, the TRS-80 ones have a nice TRS-80 slapped on top of it, and the ones for the TRS-90 have the one in blue. So if you want to play with the sample code, this is a this is a really nice way of making sure that you are actually using the DITA val properly, and the sample results match what you see here. And by the way, I hope it's obvious, don't plaster the name of the products over images the way I've done here. This is just done strictly for demonstration purposes to make plain the differences between the two conditionalized versions. If you end up playing with the demo files I posted to GitHub, it's also a sure check that you're outputting things correctly using whichever DITA file value you ended up choosing. And as I say, if you want to take a closer look at how this is all handled, check out the demo files that I posted to GitHub. Now, another thing that I don't think is emphasized enough is that you really need to think ahead about key dependency implications, because keys ultimately make you content, your DITA content very map dependent. If you produce output from single topics and you want to use keys, you have to transition those publications to be map-based. This can be frustrating if essentially all you want to do is produce a single topic, but you always have to refer back to the map from which it is being referenced. It's a little bit of a pain. It's not really a big pain, but again, if you're not used to this process, it can be a little bit disconcerting. And writers also have to get used to working with topics in the context of the map if they want to see the full content on the result. And then comes the next question, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? You can add, you can go further than the examples seen here in terms of complexity. But this ultimately adds to the complexity of using keys. ultimately documentation teams need to determine how far they want to abstract things. I've spoken to a few people who teach DITA directly to students / people who are technical writers who are using DITA, and they say to a man that if you abstract things too far, writers will get confused, and in the end they will try to circumvent the use of keys. They will basically, if they find the keys are too hard to get or understand, they will find ways of avoiding it or circumventing it. So as a good IA needs to keep that in mind as to how far you want to go with your use of keys. And don't take this the wrong way. I definitely want, keys are good. Keys are good, definitely. But I've seen some levels of abstraction that go much further than what you see here, and trying to understand what key references what and in what circumstance and in what context can be really, really fiddly. And I have seen examples of maps that go about 5 or 6 layers of abstraction deep, and it gets really hard to figure out what value comes from where. And this actually does come across as a trade-off ultimately between flexibility and opacity. Your IA ultimately needs to determine how deep you want a key and strike a balance that your writers can easily work with. So on the left-hand side, you see the original map that in Oxygen's map view, and note for example that the topic types are all they're all typed by different topic icons. On the right is the final example map that I created, and it's the exact same content except it's completely keyed. And there's nothing wrong with that, but notice that you can't see in this case how the topics are actually being, like what the topic types are. It's also longer. There are different things going on, but it's all the same content. They both, print out, so to speak, to the same number of pages, output to the same number of pages. So, and you look at the one on the right, and there's some. It's no longer as clear to the naive user, so to speak, as to what's going on, as compared to the one on the left. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this point, as the examples I'm showing here are basic. Keys can be used at much deeper and more abstract levels, and tools like XML editors and component content management systems can hide a lot of this complexity. But I think what you see here is a leading reason why people see keys as being inherently complex, when in fact, all it is that they're seeing multiple levels of key abstraction at once. So I'm really hoping that my step-by-step examples in this presentation has helped. And in the end, writers have to understand an information architect's grand scheme for key use in order to implement it. If there are so many keys to use that the writers can't keep up, they won't use them or will find ways to circumvent them. Now, some wise words on key complexity. This is one of the people that I talked to prior to doing this webinar. Lee White, who I would consider the queen of keys, and she has done some terrific presentations that I reference, by the way, shortly, on more advanced features of keys. Definitely recommended. But she has some, and she teaches a lot of people on key use, and she has some good words to say. So as she says here, some people would like to see keys used for all references. I think that is needlessly complex. I meaning Lee. References that are context specific gain nothing from being keyed. It's only when you need to flip-flop a term or a reference based on where you're using a topic that keys have value. Her advice is always to start as small as you can with keys. If you discover that there's additional reuse potential down the road, you can always switch a direct reference to an indirect one. Okay. And that is basically it for me. So these are some, I've deliberately gone out and looked at a number of different papers and videos on DITA keys, and these I think are some of the better ones that are out there. The first one is an DITA adoption white paper, fairly early one, looking at keys and key spaces. There's also the venerable Thunderbird DITA demo content collection, which has sort of a stepwise progression of key use as well. Then there is Lee White's presentation on scope keys in DITA 1.3 and getting keyed up about keys, which is a YouTube presentation on that based off the one that's just above it, which is a SlideShare file, and a previous TC Dojo open session, which I think is also worth having a look at, which is called Keys Are the Key to Reuse. And before I close, I just want to say that, you know, if you want to take a look at the code examples I posted to GitHub, and there's the URL for them again, I thought I'd make a point as to which slides in this deck refer to each of the individual code samples. So as you can see here, it talks about, you know, which slides reference which individual sets of sample docs. And if you're interested, if the listening and watching audience out there is interested in having a part 2 to this webinar, please let Liz know. I would definitely love to do one. And if I end up doing a part 2, I want to look at more complex examples, but still within a step-by-step framework that I've used here, and explain exactly what things like, say, key spaces are, as well as provide working examples of how to use things like DITA 1.3 key scopes. And hey, I'm also up for suggestions. So at this point, there's nothing definite planned, but you know, if you vote, you know, tell Liz, you know, once and twice and thrice and many times that you want to have another one on DITA keys part 2. I will I'll be more than happy to do that. And with that, woo, that's it for me.
Excellent. All right. So I'm gonna, it's time to type your questions in. Keith, I'm gonna ask you to read the questions. I'll still read them out loud, and I'll send you the transcript so you can write blog posts after this. But some of them are very dense, and so I want to give you a chance to read them. And while you do, I am going to show you all what's coming up next. Our mastermind session is next week. This is a member-driven discussion group, a community of practice where attendees present their specific challenges on topics on their mind in a confidential, supportive environment. Mastermind groups have been cited in Forbes as a key to growing your expertise and handling competency, and we have 2 going on right now. One is Everything TechCom. It covers everything from DITA to topic-based authoring to things like, do we do inline linking anymore? And the other is product focused on Arbor Text and Windchill. It's not free. It's one of the few things we do that is not, but it is a minor, it's not a high cost item, and it's mainly to make sure that everybody's got some skin in the game, and you know, you're not just dropping in to see what other people are doing. It keeps the confidentiality between members there for everyone. All right, next month, this is very exciting. This is our next TC Dojo session. We're going to have the president of the East Bay STC chapter. She was transitioning to become a technical writer, and volunteered to work on an Apache project as a technical writer, and has parlayed that into a job at Facebook. She's going to talk about how to do that kind of thing. It's not always that easy to figure out how to join an open source project as a technical writer and what to do, and how do you get noticed when you don't have a manager, you don't have an organization around you. It's going to be a really good session. All right, how do you get there? You go to tcdojo.org and scroll down to the bottom, and you'll see all the things that we've got coming up through the end of the year. All right, thank you, Keith. Here we go, lots of good questions. Let's start at the top. It looks like the first one is when you were talking about reasons to do your company name as a key. It says because OEM rebranding for multiple OEMs. Sounds about right to me. How about you?
Yep. Oh yeah, you bet. In fact, I'll tell you my tale of you know, that sort of convinced me to use keys in this way, because when I was a documentation manager, I started out at what was then ATI Technologies, which of course was then acquired by AMD, and that meant that because I hadn't been smart and I had not thought ahead to this possibility, that we had to go back to all of our end user manuals and key up all instances where we had ATI technologies, basically doing a whole lot of search and replacing, and then throwing in key values. So again, that just makes sense to do, because you may think that your company may never be bought out, and then it has. Oh, okay then. Or the flip side of that, of course, is also acquiring other companies, and it's interesting. I've now run across several instances of people who work at a company that has acquired another company which is also using DITA, and they say that it has been very handy if they've in fact followed best practices and are using keys for things like company name, product name, model number, what have you, because then they can essentially say, oh, okay, here is our set of keys. They then hand over that particular DITA file or map file, depending on how they want to play it. And then the acquired company can essentially start producing documentation using all the correct, the company name, what have you, all the trademarks and so forth, right off the bat. So it is a best practice for a very good reason.
Excellent. And you never know when sales or some executive wants to private label your product to someone else, and that's
there's the OEM angle of that as well.
Exactly.
Exactly.
All
right.
right.
Yeah.
So we have a quick question. I'm not sure if you can answer. I don't know the answer. Here's the question. We use SDL's Live Content Architect. It has the concept of variables, variable ID, variable reference. Do you think they've implemented this feature as DITA keys as the underlying elements? I wouldn't even want to guess.
That's a good question, and I'll be honest, I do not know the answer to that. That it's certainly one way which I guess they could try to resolve things, but my understanding is that the key-based mechanism does not always work. I'm trying not to say bad things about the other systems, so I won't. I think the key thing, sorry about the pun, it would be to try to take the example code on GitHub and see how it works under that system. I would hope that it would work seamlessly and flawlessly. If it doesn't, then it's and this is not just true for just SEL, but any CCMS, if it's not outputting results matching what you've seen in this presentation, then it is not corresponding fully to the DITA specification regarding keys. So in short, I don't know. And if you want to try testing things out, hey, have some sample code and play with it, see what happens.
Right, and it may be, I was going to say that they've been around a long time, so it may be that it works also with other doc types, so it might or might not, it's hard to say. All right. Here's your big question. Did you see the big one? I hate to.
No, actually,
Okay.
I can't see any of the questions. For
all right, it's going to go a long way. So here we go. The map dependency and abstraction obstacles have been our biggest holdup to implementing keys. It seems the more tangible direct reference or conditionalized elements are easier for writers to see and understand. But especially in light of the new features of DITA 1.3, are there specific best practices or use cases where direct referencing conditionalized text should be converted to keys? Variables are one example I can think of. Key a term instead of entering 2 ph tags in text with different conditions applied, like Lee said. Are there others?
Oh, and I really hesitate to. I think that the answer to that will be very much dependent on the specific circumstances of the company where it's being used, and also the mental agility of the technical writers on the team. There are some teams that I've run across that have real problems even understanding the very first, what I consider, really basic way of implementing keys. so the idea of going beyond, 2 or 3 levels of abstraction would clearly not be the best idea. I think the thing to say in this case is that it has to depend on, it has to depend not so much on the mental agility of the IA, who may want to key things up the wazoo, so to speak, but to the point where where it becomes more of a problem for writers to suss out where keys are being resolved and where those sources are. If it's taking more time for writers to figure that out, then perhaps that's one layer of abstraction too far. But as I say, it depends very much on the circumstance. I can think of one example from a very large firm that produces content on the order of, quite literally hundreds of thousands of topics. And they use, multiple layers of abstraction to handle things like essentially versionings of products. So, like the past 2 versions, the current version, and, multiple in production versions, plus the OEMs, plus, sort of, so very complex way of doing essentially versioning and branching, which is key-based, but they use the component content management system along with some very good XML editors to hide as much of that complexity from the writers as is possible. So ultimately, I think it's at least 4 or 5 layers deep in terms of the abstraction that's being used. But from the writer's perspective, it's just there and it works, and they don't have to worry too much about it. And that's primarily to do with the tools. So there's a whole bunch of variables. I can't give you one answer that answers that question, but I'm hoping that maybe my answer has given you a better idea of the scope. How's that?
I think it's a good place to start for sure. And I'll send this back to you, so maybe you'll write up a post about it.
Okay.
All right, here's a follow-up. Because of the keyword nature of indirect referencing, there are benefits to search usability using keys. Are there benefits using keys? Integration with facets or role-based filtering for DITA, where are HTML transformation tools? Good question.
Okay, I've done a fair work on. Okay, so there's 2 ways to approach that. One is like if you're using keys for handling things like, I guess, metadata, that's and that's a tricky one. There are other mechanisms for doing that, so it's not necessarily the best way of doing that, but that's one way that could be done. The other thing is that if you're if you're using keys to build up keyword use within the body content of something that, say, appears within an HTML page based on data output, then yes, that's also good. And again, the point about faceted search, where common keyed values come up as a search available term, that would also be good. But I could also see how that could also overload that. So for example, you suddenly potentially overwhelm the faceted search with examples of product name, model number, and so on and so forth within the documentation. So is there any direct benefit? I'd say that it's in some ways it's the wrong question to ask. There are other ways of being able of helping users find the content, and to be honest, I don't think keys are necessarily the best way of doing it. I think of and the name is currently escaping me, but subject scheme, for example, applying subject scheme to existing map structures is undoubtedly a better way of doing things. But then again, that in itself is another sort of a non-key based way of sort of adding an abstracted layer of metadata, in this case, to existing content.
All right, good.
I'm not sure I'm not sure that's a full answer, but that's going to have to do.
Yep. Okay, we got a couple more, and we got a couple of minutes left. So here we go. I didn't quite understand the advantages of creating image libraries with key. Can you summarize this for me? I think I'll let you take that in a blog post, because that seems like, or because we'll post the video also so you can watch this again. But yeah, let me, that's a big question. Let's get to some more, then if we have time, we'll come back. Is that okay with you, Keith?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Here's a nice one. Very dense and informative, Keith. Chapeau. Glad I switched from Naz Urbina's chatbot presentation at DITA, which was.
Sorry, Naz.
There you go. Sorry about that, guys, but Keith is better. All right. And yes, part 2, please. Can we get a copy of the slides? Is this being recorded? It is being recorded. The slides are available, will be posted with the video and everything else. So make sure that you go to tcdojo.org or that you join the mailing list, and you'll get notified about where and when. All right. The part 2, they want keys advanced and soon. Yep.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Thanks for the sample code.
Hopefully based on the step-by-step examples. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so we have one answer for a previous thing, is the SDL variables are proprietary and do not use DITA keys. Thanks for letting us know about that.
Oh,
but
okay.
You can use keys with SDL anyway, so that's cool. Double twice.
Also good to know. Okay, thanks for whoever said that.
Yeah. Also, thanks for the sample code, Keith. Get a big plus for that. And
of course, it's up on GitHub. I believe that means that, you know, I've released it to the world. So if you want to go in and make it better, you can go ahead and do so.
Excellent. All right, here's one. We translate our manuals to 19 languages. Do keys have an impact on translation?
Yes. One one thing that you need to keep in mind with keys and translation use is usually things like being careful about using an article before you have a key. So where you might have words like, say, you know, in my example where you have the TRS-80 as a key term for the model number, you might, you know, typically have like the TRS-80, whereas in French that would be la or le. And the thing is, then you need to be careful as to, you know, whether or not you're using, you know, whether or not you define whether the product term is masculine or feminine, things like that. So when you're providing a translation guide, along with all your key values, you need to talk about, you know, whether or not in context these things are you know, have these particular types of values. And, you know, the way to get around that is, wherever possible, not to use articles like these and you know, and other related things that could be problematic when looked at it from the perspective of, you know, mentioning that from within a different language. Though that's the one key, key thing. I can't get away from that bad pun. But the other thing that comes to mind is, as I say, you know, and as I say, it's related, is that when you have a list of key values for things like product names and so forth, you know, it's a really good thing to, you know, and this is actually one of the reasons why it's good to have things like an image warehouse or a product name or, you know, trademark name warehouse equivalent, is that you have a description as to what it is, so that the translators can then work with that in progress. And it's like, oh, okay, that's what that is. And, you know, now I know how to apply my translation in progress. And of course, the other thing about keys is that for the most part, if you're looking at things like product names, they will not be translated. So you might want to throw on the equivalent of like translate equals no to these terms to make sure that somebody doesn't come out and translate, you know, TRS-80 into the actual, say, phonetic equivalent in, say, one of the, you know, Chinese, Japanese, Korean languages, because if that's actually a product name, you don't necessarily want to have that translated. Those are all the things I can think about relating to localization and keys.
That sounds like a good follow-up one also for part 2, 3, or 4.
Yeah, that's potentially a whole I think, presentation in and of itself.
Right. So here's another part 2 idea: migrating existing ConRef conditional processing to advanced 1.3 with key scopes.
Oh,
Go
that
crazy.
is a good one.
All right.
Yeah.
So now we've got one last really big question. And Michael, sorry, I've been saving it because I knew it was big, although I thought Don's question was less. All right. How do you use the product or platform condition with variables instead of topic refs? I have about 15 OEMs with different values for each OEM. Currently, we use scripts to swap out my own variables values in my own files. Wow, that sounds complicated.
Yeah. Why not use keys? I mean, seriously, why not use keys? That's exactly what keys are there for.
Yeah, that's what I would have said.
So why would you swap out something else for? Yeah. No, dude, use keys.
Yes, use keys and build books on top of each other and use the processing failover to do what it's supposed to do correctly.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. He's on the old DITA OT, cannot upgrade yet. Well, from my perspective and Keith's both, we're sorry to hear about that. We both have better tools. But you still should be able to use, with the DITA old Open Toolkit, the older one, he still should be able to use maps and the failover processing.
Well, it's not
right?
It's not a DITA OT thing. It's more to do like keys were actually introduced, I believe, in DITA. I'm gonna hit myself here. I'm not sure if it's DITA 1.1 or DITA 1.2.
He's on 1.1 on 1.6.
Yeah. So if he's using 1.1, and then I'm writing DITA and keys were not introduced in 1.1, then the ConRefing mechanisms are all he'll have access to, which is in and of itself a good rationale to try to move things to the next standard on up. Yeah, actually, another thing, just for fun, I'll mention that in the current lightweight DITA mechanism, which is another thing that I've been working on, currently things like keys are really only going to be used for referencing things like product name variables, and ConRefing will be used for things at the referencing content, let's say like the paragraph level or above. So just throw that in as a little teaser.
Yeah, so let's just let's see if we can't circle back around to his question, is using variables instead of topic refs. Any ideas for that? Like he says, I only saw how to use product and platform with topic refs, but not how to use them with variables.
As I said, I think this is a really good argument for trying to move up to the next version of the DITA spec, because the key mechanism
but you don't always have that option.
But if you don't have that option, I can't tell you how to do it in a key-based manner. Right. Yeah, I mean, like if you're not familiar with tools like grep, or that's a Linux or Unix-based tool, but there are Windows equivalents, or Python, which is a really nice language for manipulating text. You can then use scripts to swap in and out values, and that sounds like you might be using something like that already. But honestly, this is exactly why keys were invented, and moving to DITA 1.2/DITA 1.3 will go a long way towards making that type of issue go away.
All right. Yeah. All right. I'm just following up on the last question.
And I still feel kind of bad about drawing somebody away from Naz's presentation, but I'll use that as a point to mention that I'll be doing a presentation tomorrow within the Adobe DITA World thing on completely different subject on Agile and DITA. So if you're working in Agile, you might want to check out my presentation, which is, I believe, the very final. So leaving the best for last. That's happening tomorrow afternoon.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Keith, for doing this, and thank you to everybody who stayed long to ask questions.
Thanks, Liz.
And we'll get this video posted shortly. And thanks for coming. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Keith.
Bye, folks.